The morning sun cast long shadows across the presidential palace as Colonel Marcus Doe adjusted his uniform for the third time. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the weight of what was about to unfold. For months, secret meetings had taken place in abandoned warehouses and forgotten cafes throughout the capital. The people of this fictional West African nation had suffered under President Alexandre Camara's iron grip for over 2 decades, watching their freedoms disappear, one by one. Sarah Thompson, a foreign correspondent, had arrived 3 weeks earlier on what appeared to be a routine assignment. But she carried with her encrypted messages from international human rights organizations, messages that would change everything. The underground resistance movement, known only as Dawn's Light, had been planning this moment for years. They had infiltrated the military, the police force, and even the president's inner circle. In the presidential mansion, Alexandre paced nervously in his ornate office. Reports from his intelligence chief had been disturbing lately. Whispers of discontent among his most trusted generals, unusual troop movements, and most concerning of all, the sudden disappearance of several key opposition leaders who had been under house arrest. His wife, Elena, watched him from the doorway, her face showing the strain of years spent as the dictator's companion. The capital city of Port Victoria buzzed with an unusual energy that morning. Street vendors noticed fewer security patrols than usual. University students gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones about rumors spreading through social media. Dr. James Mensah, a respected physician who had secretly treated tortured political prisoners for years, made his final rounds at the hospital, knowing that by evening everything would be different. At exactly noon, the first phase began. Radio stations across the country simultaneously broadcast a message that sent shockwaves through every home and street corner. The voice belonged to General Patricia Asante, the former head of military intelligence who had disappeared 6 months earlier. She announced the formation of a transitional government and called upon all citizens to remain calm while democratic institutions were restored. The message was clear: the era of oppression was ending. President Alexandre's security detail noticed the change immediately. Their radios crackled with confused reports from various military installations. Orders given by the presidential palace were being questioned, delayed, or outright ignored. The carefully constructed network of fear and intimidation that had kept the regime in power for decades was beginning to crumble. As the afternoon wore on, it became increasingly clear that this was not just another failed coup attempt, but a carefully orchestrated revolution that had been years in the making. The international community watched with cautious optimism as news reports filtered out through social media and brave journalists like Sarah Thompson. Embassy staff in neighboring countries prepared for potential evacuations while simultaneously documenting what appeared to be a peaceful transition of power. The president's attempts to contact his allies in other authoritarian regimes met with silence, as even his former supporters distanced themselves from his falling administration. By evening, the presidential palace was surrounded not by angry mobs but by disciplined soldiers who had sworn new oaths to the people rather than to any individual leader. Colonel Marcus Doe stood at the main entrance, his voice steady as he addressed the gathered crowd through a megaphone. The soldiers under his command had removed their loyalty pins bearing the president's image, replacing them with small flags representing the nation itself. Inside the palace, President Alexandre realized his situation was hopeless. His personal guard of foreign mercenaries had been quietly arrested throughout the day, replaced by local soldiers who looked at him with barely concealed contempt. Elena packed a small bag with their most precious belongings, including photographs of their children who had been studying abroad. She had always known this day might come, and had secretly prepared for it by transferring funds to accounts in neutral countries. Dr. Mensah arrived at the palace as part of a medical team, officially there to ensure the president's health and safety during the transition, but his real mission was to document any evidence of the regime's crimes that might be hidden within the compound. Room by room, they uncovered files, recordings, and other materials that would later be crucial for the truth and reconciliation process that would follow. The people of the capital began to emerge from their homes as word spread that the change in government was proceeding peacefully. Families who had been separated by political persecution began searching for their loved ones. The city's prisons were opened, and hundreds of political prisoners walked free for the first time in years. Among them was Professor David Kofi, an economics teacher who had been imprisoned for criticizing government policies in his classroom. Sarah Thompson worked tirelessly to document these historic moments, her camera capturing the faces of people experiencing freedom after decades of oppression. She interviewed former prisoners, brave soldiers, and ordinary citizens who spoke openly for the first time about their hopes for the future. Her reports would later serve as a crucial historical record of this peaceful revolution. As midnight approached, President Alexandre sat in his office one final time, staring at a portrait of his father who had been a respected leader during the country's early years of independence. He wondered how he had strayed so far from those ideals, how his desire to maintain stability had transformed into a ruthless grip on power. The weight of his actions over the past 25 years pressed down upon him like a physical burden. General Asante, who had emerged from months of hiding, addressed the nation once again. She announced that the former president would be given safe passage to leave the country, but would face international justice for crimes against his own people. The transitional government would consist of respected civil society leaders, former opposition figures who had survived the regime's persecution, and military officers who had proven their commitment to democratic principles. Dawn broke over a transformed nation as President Alexandre stepped out of the palace for the last time. The scene was surreal in its calmness. No angry crowd screamed for vengeance. No violence marred the historic moment. Instead, hundreds of citizens stood in respectful silence, many holding candles or flowers. Some wept openly, not from anger but from relief that this transition was happening without bloodshed. Colonel Marcus walked alongside the former dictator, his role now that of protector rather than captor. The military had made a commitment to ensure Alexandre's safety during his departure, understanding that how they treated their former leader would set the tone for the new democracy they were trying to build. The colonel's own father had been imprisoned by this regime 15 years earlier, yet he maintained his professional composure throughout the process. Elena clutched her husband's arm as they made their way to the waiting vehicle. She thought of their children, now young adults studying in European universities, and wondered if they would ever be able to return home. The family's legacy was forever changed, but she took some comfort in knowing that the transition was happening peacefully. She had seen what violent revolutions could do to countries, and was grateful that this change was being managed by people committed to justice rather than revenge. Dr. Mensah continued his work, documenting the regime's crimes, but he also began treating former prisoners who were finally free to seek medical attention. Many bore physical and psychological scars from years of torture and imprisonment. The hospital where he worked became a center not just for healing bodies, but for healing the soul of a nation that had endured decades of trauma. Sarah Thompson's reports were now being broadcast internationally, showing the world that peaceful transitions of power were possible even in situations that seemed hopeless. Her footage of former political prisoners embracing their families, of soldiers laying down their weapons in favor of ballot boxes, and of ordinary citizens speaking freely about their dreams for their country, became symbols of hope for oppressed people everywhere. The transitional government moved quickly to establish credibility both at home and abroad. They released all remaining political prisoners, lifted restrictions on press freedom, and began the complex process of drafting a new constitution. General Asante, despite her military background, insisted that civilian leadership must be established as quickly as possible. She had studied successful transitions in other countries and understood that the military's role should be temporary and limited. International observers began arriving to assist with the democratic transition. The African Union, the United Nations, and various diplomatic missions offered support for everything from election planning to economic reconstruction. For the first time in decades, the country's borders were truly open, and citizens could travel freely without fear of persecution upon their return. As Alexandra's plane lifted off from the airport, Many citizens gathered on rooftops and hilltops to watch it disappear into the distance. They were not celebrating his departure so much as the arrival of new possibilities for their nation. Children who had never known democracy asked their parents what it would mean for their daily lives. The answer was simple. They would finally be free to speak their minds, to choose their leaders, and to build the future they wanted for themselves and their families. 3 months after the peaceful revolution, the country was transforming in ways both large and small. Professor David Kofi had returned to his classroom, where he now taught openly about economic theories and democratic governance without fear of arrest. His students, many of whom had never heard alternative viewpoints expressed freely, eagerly absorbed these new perspectives. The university, once a place of intellectual oppression, had become a vibrant center of debate and learning. Dr. Mensah had established a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, working with international experts to ensure that the crimes of the Mao past regime were properly documented and addressed. The process was painful but necessary, allowing victims to share their stories and helping the nation understand how such abuses had been allowed to continue for so long. The Commission's work would be crucial for preventing future dictatorships from taking root. Sarah Thompson had extended her assignment indefinitely, documenting the country's remarkable transformation. She followed families as they were reunited, businesses as they reopened after years of economic stagnation, and communities as they began to trust their neighbors again. Her articles were being read worldwide, inspiring similar movements in other countries struggling under authoritarian rule. Colonel Marcus had been promoted to head the new democratic military, an institution restructured to serve the people rather than any individual leader. He worked tirelessly to retrain soldiers who had spent decades following orders without question, teaching them that their highest duty was to protect the Constitution and the democratic process. The military's new oath emphasized service to the nation and its citizens above all else. General Asante had surprised many by announcing her retirement from military service to focus on civilian life. She established a foundation dedicated to supporting democratic transitions in other African countries, sharing the lessons learned from her nation's peaceful revolution. Her decision to step back from power voluntarily demonstrated the commitment to democratic principles that had made the revolution successful. The transitional government faced enormous challenges. Years of corruption and mismanagement had left the economy in ruins, the healthcare system barely functional, and the education system in desperate need of reform. But for the first time in decades, these problems were being addressed openly and honestly. International aid began flowing in, not to prop up a dictator, but to support genuine democratic development. Elections were scheduled for the following year, and multiple political parties began forming and registering candidates. The process was messy and sometimes chaotic, as people who had been denied political expression for decades suddenly found their voices. But this chaos was welcomed as a sign of genuine democracy taking root. Former prisoners found themselves running for office alongside academics, doctors, and community leaders. The former president Alexandre remained in exile, living quietly in a small European country that had agreed to host him temporarily. He followed news from his homeland through international media, watching with complex emotions as his former subjects built the democracy he had denied them. His children had made the difficult decision to change their names and build new lives, forever marked by their father's legacy but determined to contribute positively to the world. As the first anniversary of the revolution approached, the transformation was undeniable. The capital city of Port Victoria buzzed with an energy that older residents hadn't felt since their independence decades earlier. New businesses opened daily. Artists created murals celebrating freedom on walls that had once displayed only government propaganda, and young people organized festivals and cultural events without seeking official permission. Professor Kofi had been elected to head the Constitutional Convention, where representatives from every region and demographic group worked to create a governing document that would prevent future authoritarian rule. The debates were intense and sometimes heated, but they were conducted openly with full media coverage. Citizens could watch their democracy being built in real time, and many gathered in community centers to discuss the proceedings. Dr. Mensah's Truth and Reconciliation Commission released its preliminary findings, documenting over 10,000 cases of human rights violations during the former regime. The report was painful to read but necessary for the nation's healing. Rather than seeking revenge, the commission focused on understanding how such abuses had been allowed to continue and what institutions needed to be built to prevent their recurrence. Sarah Thompson published a book about the revolution that became an international bestseller. The proceeds were donated to educational programs in the country, helping to build schools and train teachers for the new democratic era. Her continued reporting showed that while progress was sometimes slow and frustrating, the commitment to democratic values remained strong among both leaders and ordinary citizens. The economy began showing signs of recovery as international investors gained confidence in the country's stability and democratic institutions. Small businesses flourished as entrepreneurs no longer feared arbitrary government interference. Agricultural production increased as farmers gained secure property rights. The banking system, once controlled by the dictator's cronies, was reformed and open to competition. Colonel Marcus announced that the military would be significantly reduced in size, with many soldiers transitioning to civilian careers in construction, education, and other fields where their skills could contribute to national development. The military budget was redirected toward education and healthcare, priorities that had been neglected during the authoritarian era. Religious and traditional leaders who had been forced to remain silent during the dictatorship emerged as important voices in the democratic transition. They organized community discussions about reconciliation and forgiveness, helping to heal the divisions that had been created by decades of oppression. Their involvement demonstrated that democracy could coexist with traditional African values and customs. International organizations praised the country's peaceful transition as a model for other nations emerging from authoritarian rule. Delegations from across Africa and beyond visited to study how the revolution had succeeded without violence and how democratic institutions were being built from the ground up. The country that had once been an embarrassment to the international community became a source of inspiration and hope. As election day approached, campaign rallies filled stadiums and public squares with unprecedented crowds. The enthusiasm was infectious, with people participating in the democratic process for the first time in their lives. Opinion polls showed a competitive race among several qualified candidates, each offering different visions for the country's future but all committed to maintaining democratic governance. Election day dawned clear and bright across the nation. Long lines formed at polling stations before sunrise, as citizens prepared to cast their first truly free votes in over 2 decades. Elderly residents who remembered the country's early democratic period wept with joy as they marked their ballots. Young people voted for the first time, many bringing their children to witness this historic moment. Professor Kofi cast his ballot early, then spent the day visiting polling stations. As an international observer, he was struck by the orderly, peaceful nature of the voting process and the obvious pride citizens took in participating. Former political prisoners served as poll workers alongside former government officials, symbolizing the reconciliation that had made the transition possible. Dr. Mensah voted with his family, then returned to work at a hospital that had been transformed from a place of fear under the old regime to a genuine center of healing. He treated several elderly patients who had waited months to seek medical care, afraid during the dictatorship that their medical records might be used against them politically. Sarah Thompson documented the election from multiple perspectives, interviewing voters from every walk of life. Her reports captured the historic nature of the moment while also noting the challenges that lay ahead. Democracy was not a destination, but a journey that would require constant vigilance and participation from all citizens. The results were announced 3 days later after careful counting and verification by international observers. Professor Kofi had won the presidency with 42% of the vote, requiring a runoff election against Dr. Amara Diallo, a former human rights lawyer who had received 38%. The fact that no candidate achieved a majority was seen as a healthy sign of genuine political competition. Colonel Marcus, now a civilian, had won election to the National Assembly, where he would help oversee military affairs and ensure that the armed forces remained subordinate to civilian authority. His transformation from military officer to democratic politician symbolized the broader changes taking place throughout society. The runoff election 2 weeks later was equally peaceful and well conducted. Professor Kofi won with 54% of the vote, and Dr. Diallo immediately congratulated him and pledged to serve as a constructive opposition leader. The peaceful transfer of power, even between competing candidates, demonstrated that democratic norms were taking root. At his inauguration, President Kofi stood where the former dictator had once delivered speeches demanding absolute obedience. Instead, he pledged to serve the people and to step down peacefully when his term ended. He invited all citizens, including those who had supported other candidates, to participate in building their democracy. His speech was carried live on radio and television stations that were now free from government control. General Asante, watching the ceremony from the crowd, reflected on how far the country had come in just 2 years. The peaceful revolution had succeeded beyond her wildest dreams, not just in removing a dictator but in building the institutions and culture necessary for sustained democracy. She thought of all the people who had sacrificed for this moment, including those who had not lived to see it. As the ceremony concluded and President Kofi began his work, citizens returned to their daily lives with a new sense of possibility. Children walked to schools where they could learn freely, farmers tended crops they truly owned, and entrepreneurs planned businesses without fear of arbitrary interference. The revolution had ended not with the dictator's departure, but with the establishment of a democracy that would belong to future generations. The story of this peaceful revolution would be told for decades to come, inspiring other oppressed peoples and reminding free nations of the precious nature of democratic governance. In a world often marked by violence and division, this small West African country had shown that change was possible through courage, organization, and an unwavering commitment to human dignity and freedom.